gentlemen, Dr. Kerry Monahan.
What a really nice introduction. I don't have to cover anything. I'll just remind you that the Sierra Fund is a nonprofit in Nevada City, and our mission is to restore the ecosystem and community resiliency of the Sierra Nevada. So that's a pretty broad mission statement. And really, in the last 10 years, we've focused on the impacts of the California gold rush, which I'm going to cover today in a few different ways. This cover slide gives away the whole punchline. We're going to look at it again at the end. But essentially, you see Malakoff Diggins, once the largest hydraulic mine, the tunnels that might be draining mines just like this, what reservoirs are filling up with, the sediment that they're filling up with, and what it looks like when they're spilling over. So it's all told right here. I'm not trying to hide the lead. So I'll go over a brief history of hydraulic mining, how mercury gets into our watersheds and into fish, how we're using LiDAR to identify these hydraulic mine sites, and then two different case studies, which really each could be hour-long talks in and of themselves. I'm going to try and summarize our findings from both our Malakoff Diggins case study and the Combie Reservoir case study, and how all of this integrates into the Headwater Mercury Source Reduction Strategy, which is really a strategy document and technical advisory group that the Sierra Fund has convened and will meet regularly, quarterly up in the Sierra Nevada to address this legacy contamination issue in the Sierra Nevada. So first, there was a lot of mining that took place in California. There's more than 40,000 abandoned mine sites in the state of California. These are the gold rush mines in the Sierra Nevada, and these are the mercury mines on the Coast Range. So mercury was mined in the Coast Range and brought over to the gold mines in the Sierra Nevada and used in a couple of different ways for both hard rock and hydraulic mines. So the mercury that we have mostly in this area is not something that's occurring naturally out of that geology. It's something that was brought over there as quicksilver in these 76-pound flasks and used at these mine sites so that it could help get out that fine-grained gold. That they were using the mercury to amalgamate with the gold. That way it would become heavier, settle out, and they could collect that amalgam and retort off the mercury and have gold. So a lot of abandoned mine sites, each one having some sort of physical and or chemical hazard associated with them. This keeps us busy for a really long time. There's a lot of really good work to be done on these mine sites. How many of you have seen this picture before? Excellent. It's an iconic picture of hydraulic mining. It is at Malakoff Diggins during its heyday, which was once the largest hydraulic mine probably in the world, because this is where this technology was developed. I presented in the summer in July at a conference in Rhode Island, the International Conference on Mercury as a Global Pollutant. And I showed really the same slide there and asked who had seen this before. And they said, yes, this is the picture for hydraulic mining. This is something developed in our state at this site to get this fine-grained gold, but it's still being used all over the world today. We've had a film crew from Suriname, actually, through a grant that the Department of Interior sponsored, come and interview Izzy Martin and I at this site so that they could better understand the impacts of hydraulic mining, and specifically mercury, and that it's still having on our communities today. And the reason they were so interested is this is the technique they're using in Suriname and in other places in the world. Yeah, please interrupt. I really don't mind. Yeah, absolutely. So thank you. So this is water at high pressure that is, I call it power washing away the hillsides. This is the auriferous gravels from the tertiary rivers that are at the top of the mountains. How did river gravels get to the top of the mountains? Well, the mountains weren't there when we had these rivers during the Eocene period running north-south in our state. And then with the tectonic uplift of the Sierra Nevada, we now have river gravels that are high up on those mountain cliffs. So the miners were working their way up the modern day rivers and continuing to see this. They knew what they were targeting. They continued to see the alluvium in the cliffside until they found these really big deposits, this being Malakoff Diggins. So what they're doing is they're power washing away the hillside. They're creating a slurry, and I'm trying not to give away the next slide where I'm really going to explain where it goes. So that's as far as I'm going to go there. This is what the site looks like today. This is a beloved California state park. Malakoff Diggins State Historic Park. It's in fact on the National Registry of Historic Sites. It in and of itself is a protected landscape. Traditional mine reclamation techniques are not really viable here because keeping this pit and this huge aha moment when you walk up to it and you see the size and extent of this extravagant operations is part of the resource, the cultural resource of the site. So at a traditional mining site, these might be terraced back and revegetated to prevent a lot of the erosion that's taking place here. But at Malakoff Diggins, that, for example, would destroy these historic cliffs. This is a really interesting site to do research on. So it looks more like this today. Let's see, a lot of California school children visit this site. They do it as part of their experiential learning of the California Gold Rush days. So a little bit more about how they use mercury. I wanted to get this slide because it's in fact learning how they use mercury that helps us figure out where it is today and how it's still moving through our system. Key to abandoned mine assessment in general is understanding the operation of that site. And we worked really closely with some cultural archaeologists to be able to learn about the different phases of hydraulic mining that took place here. So here you have the high pressure water cannon that's power washing the hillsides into these sluices. This is a nice picture of where that material would be conveyed to. And this one gives you a pretty good indication of some scale to those sluices and how they added mercury in those sluices and how they took rocks that were too big to move down out. And so a lot of times when you're at these mine sites, you just see a pile of rock that looks kind of all the same size, if you will. And that's likely because there was some sort of undercurrent or sluice there. Now, there was early days hydraulic mining at Malakoff Diggins, which I often call the garden hose variety of hydraulic mining. It was kind of the mom and pop version. It was the single guy with his mining claim, and it wasn't these huge monitors and this amount of power. Incidentally, that may be the time period when mercury was used so much that it was spread so much and not recovered well that it was spread widely. And it might be why we still see a lot of mercury coming out of the site. Because once it was fully industrialized like this by the North Bloomfield Mining Company, they were a lot more efficient in what they were collecting and using over and over again. And it's from those business records that we can estimate how much mercury was used at these sites, because this is a huge expense for these miners to continue to buy the mercury. So for the entire state, or Sierra Nevada, it's estimated that about 26 million pounds of mercury were brought over to the Coast Range and used in the Sierra Nevada in hard rock and hydraulic mine sites. And then because it was messy, it was estimated that about 10 to 30% of that mercury was lost to the environment. So when we started this, when we started this work, we really thought, and we're told by many, that most of the mercury had moved downstream. That's why the Bay Delta had mercury problems. It had all washed out, and these mine sites were just really eroding natural sediment off the cliff walls, denuded areas. Well, that turned out to be too much of a simplified version of what was going on. So by better understanding how it was used, we could look for where it was. We had the ability to detect mercury at much lower limits for quite some time. I would say over the last 30 years, the laboratory's ability to detect mercury at lower and lower levels improved so much that now as scientists, we weren't getting this non-detect, non-detect, non-detect. We were actually finding out where the mercury was, when it's moving, and what form it's in. So a greater understanding of these low levels and the implications they have in the food chain. So very briefly, this is probably a process a lot of you are familiar with, but I wanted to make sure and cover it. Mercury was applied as inorganic quicksilver by the miners. However, it can become methylated by the bacteria under the right conditions and incorporated into the food chain. And once that methyl mercury is in the food chain, it can biomagnify with every trophic step and become concentrated at these higher trophic levels. So you have bass that have high levels of mercury in the tissue for two reasons. One is that bass probably lived a long time, bioaccumulation. The other is that it's the top of the food chain, so it eats the fish and lots of them in the trophic level below, and that's biomagnification. So we have mercury changing forms, and what we thought of at first as very low levels in the sediment and in the water can be dangerously high levels in the tissue of the fish that people eat. Reservoirs are an environment where mercury can methylate. However, it can methylate in lots of microenvironments on the way down, so to speak, from the mine site to the reservoir. So I don't mean to say it doesn't methylate until it gets to the reservoir. It's just that reservoirs themselves are kind of the ideal location for mercury methylation. We have mercury contaminated sediment coming into these reservoirs from upstream mine sites. And when this stratifies, you can have a low oxygen environment at the bottom of the reservoir where mercury can become methylated and incorporated into that food chain. So then reservoirs become a very important component. Understanding the methylation conditions there, obviously they're also an exposure pathway because people will fish in reservoirs and bass will often be in these reservoirs. So the human health implications of mercury are really well understood. It's a neurotoxin that can have permanent neurological effects on especially fetuses and children, where the neurosystem is still being developed. So these sensitive populations are the ones that the fish consumption advisories are really targeted to, women who are of childbearing age and also children themselves. But there's other populations that are perhaps also sensitive, and that is people who fish for sustenance. They eat a lot more fish than we might predict. It's more than 1 or 2 meals a week, and it's more than 1 or 2 meals a month. It's fish every day. And that subsistence fishery component in different groups of people is something that we're still trying to better understand the effect that could be having. But we just know it's a very important population. So to date, the primary public health strategy to reduce methylmercury exposure has been to issue fish consumption advisories. These are issued by OEHA, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and they go a little something like this. They're following some of those basic principles that we just talked about with the food chain. They say that rainbow trout, being lower on the food chain and not piscivorous, are relatively good choice. So you could eat more of them. Whereas the bass and or piscivorous trout, like brown trout, might have higher levels of mercury, and you should eat less of them. Then they try and target the different populations. So women over 45 and men can safely eat more fish than those sensitive populations. So this is a general advisory for all reservoirs in the Sierra Nevada. In addition, some of them have site-specific advice. I was really confused as to why all sites didn't have site-specific advice when we first started this work. And in fact, some of that site-specific advice that's out there is incomplete. It says, for example, at Rollins Reservoir, don't eat catfish. But it doesn't mention any of the other species. Well, to a layperson in the public, is that because those other species are not contaminated with mercury? No. It means that they didn't have a large enough sample size to make a prediction at a high enough confidence interval to issue a public health advisory. So the Sierra Fund tackled this problem by going out and collecting, at this point, more than 250 fish, sending them off to trace metal mercury labs, and working with OEHA to develop that sampling and analysis plan so that they could use those data and issue site-specific advisories if warranted for those sites. The other thing we've done is we've talked to anglers. We've talked to more than 400 anglers with a catch and consumption survey so that they report what they ate in the previous 30 days, from which we can calculate their methylmercury exposure. This is a survey that was developed by Department of Public Health and used by Dr. Fraser Schilling throughout the Bay Delta. We took that same survey and tried to use it up in the reservoirs where we are so that we had a nice comparable data set. And that's how we were able to identify additional sensitive populations and site-specific consumption advice for those areas. Okay, so this is one of the more exciting new endeavors that we started this summer embarking on. This is the only slide like this that I'm going to show you. What you're looking at is LiDAR. This is three-dimensional imagery that we have for the entire Tahoe National Forest. And we're working with the Tahoe National Forest to identify and assess all of the hydraulic mine sites and their features in this whole region. We started by doing 3 different subwatersheds this summer with a couple graduate students. We did a subwatershed in the North Yuba, one in the Middle Yuba, and this is the one we looked at in the South Yuba. And what we're doing is that we're rectifying different existing data sets on hydraulic mine pits. There was one created by USGS and one created by NRCS. And you're seeing the different overlay issues that we're having when we project those onto the LiDAR. And then we're going out into the field and doing additional surveying of the landscape to rectify those data sets, get estimates of not only how many hydraulic mine sites are, but the surface area that they cover. And we're able to also get important features. For example, this is Alpha and Omega down over here. And this yellow star is the debris control dam, Scotchman Creek debris control dam, where those mines had permits to issued permits to transport and store the hydraulic mining debris that was coming off their site at that location. Those permits were issued by the California Debris Commission, now subsumed by Army Corps of Engineers. We have those historic records, and they're fascinating. They're fascinating to look at it, to where the mines were, when they were sending this stuff downstream. Before the Scotchman Debris Control Dam was built, these same mines had permits to deposit their material as far downstream as Englebright. So this is how the watershed was being operated. It was being industrialized in this way. At first, it was, the mining companies could send things downstream without a problem. Then you had the Sawyer decision that said, stop sending it downstream because it was ruining the farms in Marysville. Then you had the Caminetti Act that said, all right, you can resume hydraulic mining, but you have to have a permit to where you're going to store your debris. There's a long history here between reservoirs, dams, and mines. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our case study at Malakoff Diggins. The goal of this project at Malakoff was to do three things. One is to figure out the form that mercury's in and how it's being transported. The other is we wondered if we could put in a relatively inexpensive meter, a turbidity meter, that could take measurements really frequently, like every 15 minutes. And then from those data, calculate the amount of suspended sediment and particulate-bound mercury that's moving through the system. And the last thing we did was, from those calculations, we calculated the sediment and mercury loads coming out of this single mine site. So this picture does a couple things. It gives you an orientation to the park itself, the major features, and then also the water quality sampling plan. So this is Malakoff Diggins hydraulic mine pit. It's about 6,000 feet long, 3,000 feet wide, and up to 600 feet deep in places. There are two tunnel systems here that I'm going to mention. The infamous one, or the famous one, is the North Bloomfield Tunnel. It's about 8,000 feet long, and it had an access shaft every 1,000 feet, and it was built in record time. It was an engineering feat of its day. And they were operating this pit and then sending that material, after it had gone through the currents and sluices, away from where they were operating. So it was coming down here and entering Humbug Creek. Then with the change in the laws, with the Sawyer decision and Caminetti Act, they decided, no, we're going to plug that up. So it's currently plugged still today, and material's no longer coming out of the North Bloomfield Tunnel. However, if you hike the trail down to the South Yuba River, you can see these different access shafts. They look like ponds along the way, but a lot of them are, they're about 200 feet deep. A lot of them have standing headspace of water, 50 to 75 feet deep, depending on how much they've kind of filled in over time. Now, incidentally, I mentioned that early days of hydraulic mining, the mom and pop version days. Well, that's actually when Hiller Tunnel was constructed. This Dr. Hiller Sheets was a woman's doctor in Nevada City, so you have to understand the historic pieces to figure out how this was operating, what the current conditions really are. He wrote home to his father and he said, I'm not going to use these sluices or these wood boxes that people are using. I'm going to build a tunnel from nowhere to nowhere, and I'm going to send all of my material through it, and it's going to work so well as a sluice. Everybody, just wait and see. Everybody's going to be jealous of my tunnel. So he did. He built a 500-foot long tunnel and used it as a sluice, adding mercury in that tunnel itself. And in fact, a bunch of other people did copy him, and we have other tunnels from nowhere to nowhere, really. In other words, there isn't a big pit behind them throughout the park. And better understanding the contribution that those tunnels play today is chapters down the road. So the incident is that the entire pit currently drains out Hiller Tunnel. It's filled in to such an extent and been excavated to such an extent that it all comes out there. That's just fabulous, because I want to know what the effect of the pit is on the downstream waterways. And instead of having 5 or 6 different places that I have to set up a monitoring scheme for, I got one. So the sampling plan is simple. We have a background site at Humbug Creek at Road 1, at Release Hill Road, where it's considered not contaminated, or at least not affected by what's coming out of the pit. Then we have a site of the actual discharged area, and then we have downstream at a Gage site where these two confluence. So I'll often be talking about the contribution to Humbug Creek instead of Hiller Tunnel, in part because there's these other areas that could be affecting it. So the plan was to sample at least 3 to 5 different storm events during the rising, peak, and falling limbs of these storms. We used ultra clean methods, clean hands, dirty hands. We used trace metal EPA certified labs. We actually sent them up to Seattle, Washington. We used only lab issued bottles that had been acid washed and double bagged. They were analyzed at the lab according to EPA method 1630, which has a detection limit of down to 0.02 nanograms per liter. So when I'm talking trace metal mercury sampling, that's what I'm talking about. We also did event-based sampling. Unfortunately, I think it's been too often that if we were assessing a site and taking a sample during a water sample, it would be during base flow conditions. And you might incorrectly state that you didn't have a mercury problem. And that's because you weren't taking the sample during these storm events. So our take-home message here is that we need these low detection limits and we need storm events. All right, so this is what it looks like when we're out there in the rain during a storm event. This is road 1. You can see that it's slightly turbid, of course. This is the tunnel itself, and you can see, I hope you can see how yellow that water looks. It's a very Thai iced tea color from the iron oxides that are in suspension. And then this is down at the Gage site. I'm going to show you a picture of the equipment that we installed there. And then this picture over here gives you a good idea of the mixing zone where you have Humbug Creek coming in, relatively clear, and then Diggins Creek contributing to that. At the Gage site, we installed really 2 pieces of equipment. One measured stage continuously every 15 minutes. So that's giving us an idea of how high the water is. It's pressure reading. So as the water goes up, this little pressure transducer says more, more pressure. And we relate that to a discharge measurement that we actually take. And we have a turbidity meter. Turbidity is an optical property of the water. It's just how cloudy it is. It shines a light into that water, measures the backscatter. And we have this simple meter out there, and it does this reading every 15 minutes. So we have really nice continuous measurements of both stage and turbidity. This on the side is an ISCO auto sampler so that we could take samples even when we weren't there. We could program it to take a sample, say, every 4 hours once the turbidity went up so that we didn't have to camp out for every storm event. So these are the hydrographs for just 2 of the years we monitored, giving you an idea of when grab samples were taken. We tried to take the rising, peak, and falling limb of at least 3 to 5 different storm events, and each sample was measured for total suspended sediment and mercury in both the filtered and non-filtered samples. I want to explain what that looks like. What it means is that we send 2 bottles to the lab that are taken at the exact same time. One we considered non-filtered, and the lab takes this bottle and gets a reading of mercury off of it. The other one, they filter first, and then they take a reading from it. The difference between those 2 is what we're calling particulate bound mercury. And this is the best picture I have to show you what we think that means. These are photomicrographs taken by USGS and published in this open file report, scanning electron micrographs of beads of mercury on amalgam. Ideally, these would be beads of mercury on a piece of sediment, because that's how we imagine particulate-bound mercury to move. So to give you a little bit of scale here, if I were a cherry and I were on a whale's back, the cherry would be the mercury and the whale would be the silted clay particle. So these particles act like silt and clay. They stay in suspension and they travel really long distances. That's a game changer for understanding mercury fate and transport processes. The mining industry typically thinks of mercury as a heavy element that settles out and it stays as quicksilver. This is different. So looking at 5 different storm events in the simplest form, this is just concentration data from these 3 different sites, Road, Hiller, and Gage 3. So first thing to notice is that the road site, our background site, yeah, it's a good background. Second thing, so the majority of the particulate bound mercury source is coming from Hiller Tunnel, which is also seen down at the Gage site. Check. The second thing is the form that mercury is traveling in. So the dissolved mercury fraction for all of these sites really doesn't change much. What we're seeing is that the particulate bound mercury makes up the majority of the mercury that's coming off these sites. So the answer to that first question is yes. Mercury is primarily transported as particulate bound rather than in its dissolved form. So can we use these continuous readings to look at or to make proxies for total suspended sediment and particulate bound mercury? Okay, so x-axis has the 2 things we measured, turbidity and pressure. That's that stage. This is a rating curve for telling us for any pressure, we can calculate the discharge or how much water is in that creek. And we're really in a narrow range here. We're really not able to get into the water after about 30 CFS. It's way too dangerous. So this is an underestimate of how much is really coming out of there, because the way we measure discharge is standing in it with our waders. Similarly, with turbidity, the meter only goes up to 2,000 NTU. We know from other studies that are being conducted in the area that the turbidity can actually go up to 10,000 NTU. So our meter stops reading at 2,000 NTU. It's a bit like having a scale that only measures 50 pounds. I stand on it and it says 50 pounds. Well, I'm more than that. So this is giving us an estimate for total suspended sediment and particulate-bound mercury in that range. When we look at these data over time, we see this is the discharge as it goes up and down during the storm events and when the samples were taken. And this is turbidity during those storms and when it goes up, how long it stays up, how high it goes. So it's frequency, duration, rate of change, magnitude, and timing. Just like with the hydrograph, what is the turbidity doing and what is the particulate-bound mercury doing? Well, of course, they're very related and following those same curves. Now, I wanted to explain this because the next jump I'm going to make is from this continuous data over time, we calculated the loads, how much was moved downstream. And that means we calculated the area under the curve. So not just the peak, but how much moved over time. Okay, so these two different storm events, when you really zoom in, this is what us hydrologists really look for. When the sediment moves, has to do with the antecedent conditions of when the storm starts. So this is a storm that starts out pretty dry and it's got to spend time wetting up before the sediment starts to move. This is a storm later in March that's already really wet. The ground is wet, saturated, and as soon as it starts to rain, the turbidity goes all the way up. So every storm has a different signature, if you will, and a different effect. So we are seeing that kind of zoomed in. Okay, so yes, you can use, and we had pretty good approximations for total suspended sediment and mercury. All right, so what's the annual sediment load? Well, these data are actually pretty hot off the press. This is where the South Yuba River looks like where Humbug Creek enters. So there you have the winter water upstream, and here you have the entry of Humbug Creek into the South Yuba River. EPA asked me for pictures. The picture's worth 1,000 words. I think that's the picture that tells the whole story, really. So when we published the Humbug Creek Watershed Assessment Report, we only had 2 water years worth of data. So we talked about 3,000 acre feet of water, about 500 tons of sediment, and about 100 grams of mercury. But we wondered, those weren't very big water years. What would a big water year look like? So I finished analyzing the data, I think it was last week, for all of the rest of the years that we currently have. And 2017 is indeed a much bigger year. You all remember last winter. And we calculated as much as 3,000 tons of sediment. That's just the suspended sediment load. That's not bed load. We didn't also measure bed load. That's just the suspended sediment. In addition, we calculated almost 600 grams of mercury. That's over a pound of mercury coming out of this mine site on the suspended particles. So again, one form of mercury moving downstream. So that's a big change. A little bit more about the loads and what they mean. These graphs are organized by water year. So 2012 water year and 2013 water year, and then divided up by the different storm events that occurred during those water years. What we see is that for each one of these, almost half of the sediment load was delivered by a single storm, that big storm of the year. And that's true for all those years, even though I'm not going to continue to go into that. So about 200 tons of material of the 500 tons delivered that year came during that single storm. And that really helps us inform some of the remediation options that might be effective at this site. Okay, so that's that third check mark. There's a lot more work going on at Malakoff Diggins, and this slide is meant to remind me to tell you all of that. We have USGS out there doing ground-based LiDAR work of the cliffs to be able to determine their erosion rates. We've looked at the water quality coming into the pit, because if it's clean, maybe it could be diverted around the pit, if the pit is a source of contamination. And I also alluded to these additional source areas that aren't the pit itself, but there's other impacts.
Where has the money come from all of this fabulous work?
Thank you so much. Recently, this project was awarded $8 million through a budget change proposal, and is giving parks the resources that they need to advance the development of different remediation alternatives at the site.
Recently,
Prior, go ahead.
fairy godfathers have been.
Our previous fairy godmothers, yes, the Sierra Nevada Conservancy gave us a watershed assessment grant for the site, which funded all of the research that the Sierra Fund has done to this point. And then we had the Department of Water Resources give us a grant through our Integrated Regional Watershed Management Planning Group, CABI, the Cosumnes American Bear Yuba, and that funded not only our work, but USGS's work and others to be able to advance a lot of this. We've also had more than 6 master's students finish their theses on this site, and that's greatly broadened the depth and breadth of this effort. Did I forget one?
The LiDAR and the physical hazards from.
Yeah, the Department of Conservation had the LiDAR flown for this site and did the physical. I knew you were going for something. I was like, I can't get there right now. I'm thinking about the next slide. Department of Conservation has helped parks remediate the physical hazards on this site, including some of those access shafts that are along the way as you go down. So that fencing has been redone. One of them has a new boardwalk going across it, and it's been absolutely fabulous for Department of Parks and Recreation to have DOC step in. John Machenkos, who's here, and Glenda Marsh is here, step in and say, we have resources that can help you. And for our parks to say, you do? You know about this stuff? That's great. Please, we need you. It's been a lovely thing to see that come together. So. All right, so what can be done? Well, we have a list of things, and nobody is sure exactly what, but these are kind of some of the things on the consideration list. So diverting water around the pit, maybe, especially if it doesn't have maintenance issues or other impacts that we might not know to historic resources. Retaining sediment in the pit, plugging that tunnel is one of the most obvious ones people tend to want to talk about, and having sediment and water fill up the pit. Well, how long until it's no longer, until it's completely full? Would the sediment settle out? Can we add a filtration system so that we filter that water and have filtered water go downstream? Would it be passive? Would it require power? What kind of maintenance would it require? And all of this in the environment of preserve and protect the cultural resources of the site. This is by no means a story that's over. It's really just beginning. And a lot of resources are needed for state parks to continue to sort that out. However, I think that the research we've done so far is giving us the sense that any effort to reduce the turbidity, either with erosion control, passive filtration, or reducing the stream power, is going to reduce the particulate-bound mercury transport downstream and loading to those streams and rivers. So it does help us think about what might work there. All right, so what about all that stuff that came out of those hydraulic mine sites, not just Malakoff, but across the watershed now? Where is it? Well, this is a picture taken of Deer Creek. I really live just downstream of this a little bit, and I was told this isn't very clear. This is sediment from bank full to bank full, and a creek running just right on top of it. Very similarly, here we have Greenhorn Creek 101 years later, bank full with sediment to sediment with a little creek running right on top of it. So this hydraulic mining debris, contaminated with mercury, is still moving downstream. And reservoirs have, like I said, a long history with mine sites. So sediment can be trapped by these reservoirs and incidentally take up that water storage space. Reservoirs are well known for blocking the passage of fish coming upstream, but they're also blocking the passage of sediment coming downstream. And that creates this phenomenon of hungry waters where you can create erosion in the downstream reaches of the reservoir. Reservoirs are man-made facilities that require constant maintenance, and each one of them has a limited lifetime. And we've got to be reminded of this with our Oroville Dam last year. So I think this is a conversation we have to keep bringing up. So how do you maintain these facilities to restore this water storage space? And how do you do it in a place that you know has mercury contamination? Well, that's been the challenge of the Nevada Irrigation District. They've worked with us in a number of different ways to develop this project at Combie Reservoir. Combie Reservoir is one of 3 impoundments on the Bear River. Upstream of it is Rollins Reservoir, where you actually just saw that picture of Greenhorn Creek coming in. And downstream of it is Camp Far West. So Combie Reservoir is a relatively small reservoir, 5,555 acre-feet, but it's been a great place to try and develop this technology and perhaps use it at other sites. So we call this the Combie Reservoir Sediment and Mercury Abatement Project. Simply put, the irrigation district contracted with a range of different aggregate mining companies for a long time. And that halted in 2013 when the techniques that those miners were using was stirring up mercury. So they knew they had to come up with a new way. So this is how much sediment has accumulated in Combie Reservoir since just that time, since just 2003. If the irrigation district did nothing, the reservoir would continue to fill up and become less and less of a reservoir, all right? So what they did is they developed this project, and keep in mind, industry often looks at this and says, that's not the most cost-efficient way of removing sediment from a reservoir. No, it's not. It's a much slower process because we're trying to do it in a way that doesn't stir up sediment. So we have a floating electric dredge that has a cutter head that's about 30 feet long and has a vacuum head at the bottom. And that sucks that sediment and water into the vacuum head, creating very little turbidity. This is the same technology that's used at Lake Tahoe to maintain their dock space. So it's meant to be very good for the not stirring up stuff. And you create this slurry that then goes to an offshore treatment plant, which I'm going to talk to you about. What treatment steps would that be? Well, the heart of it is that the slurry can get spun in this centrifuge. The centrifuge has reverse drilled holes in it, and it spins at 60 to 80 Gs. And everything of specific gravity 4 or greater goes to the outer edges of this water jacket and gets shunted off. So you get gold, you get mercury, and you get mercury gold amalgam when you put that slurry through this. The whole process in itself is the sediment removal component, step 1, getting it. In this case, these are just test trials that have been done to date. So we haven't yet had a dredge on the reservoir to do that part. I just started by showing you. We've had a backhoe loading up this spray shaker. And then it's gone through a centrifuge, comes out, in kind of a mess, actually. So you might have spun out the mercury, but now you have really turbid water that has to go through a water treatment steps. So these are two different tests two different sets of tests, too much studies, right, basically, that the irrigation district and us at Sierra Fund have put together to try and test the equipment efficiency. We had 2 critical questions. One was, how much mercury does the process remove? Does it work? And can clean water be returned to the reservoir? So to determine how well it worked, we did 4 different closed system tests in 2009, where basically everything that went in the machine and came out was measured. I mean, all the water, all the sediment. And of course, we did budgets for that, including for mercury. It was quite a scene to have a bunch of equipment operators out there and me saying, no, we have to measure everything in 5-gallon buckets and stir it with the grout mixer and put, it was hilarious, actually. But we did it. And from that, we were able to calculate the percent removal of mercury. You have to measure what goes in and what comes out to get a good estimate of that. So let me explain what those test results look like. The first is understanding that the mercury that goes in, or in the heads, is divided up into these 3 different components. Mercury associated with the fines, mercury associated with grain sizes bigger than the fines, and then the liquid elemental mercury that was captured by that mechanical extraction or centrifuge process. If you don't get bogged down on a table on a PowerPoint slide, because really what this is saying is that we estimated about a 93% removal rate of what? Of free liquid elemental mercury. The other fractions of mercury associated with those fines didn't change. So this can be summarized into a conceptual model, where if you have all the mercury going in, we got the free elemental mercury out with the centrifuge. But that which is bound to silts and clays really didn't change. So that's why that water treatment step, this one, can clean water be returned to the reservoir, is still so important. How do we test that? Well, we did a series of different polymers into treating it. And this is our results slide for that. What you're looking at is river upstream compared to river downstream with 2 settling tanks in between. For first settling tank, second settling tank. For aluminum, mercury, nickel, zinc. We tested a suite of metals determined by the anti-degradation study, not just mercury, because you don't want to make something worse by accident, right? So you're interested in mercury. What about everything else? Yes, we have everything else to measure too. And I've only put some of these interesting ones on this slide. Take-home message here is that we have the regulatory criteria for mercury, for aluminum, for all of them in that red bar. And the compliance point is 300 feet downstream of where it's discharged from. So this light blue bar is below the red one for all of those. And we measured the difference between tank 1 and tank 2 and how those polymers were working to be able to select the best ones. This was one of my master's students' theses that really he just finished this last, whatever it was, semester. We learned a lot by doing these tests with the irrigation district about how to measure mercury and also about the process itself. In particular, it's very hard to sample the mercury going in and coming out of these machines because it's in many different forms. And it's the free elemental mercury especially is not evenly mixed throughout. So we might take these representative samples and they're not representative at all. I think the mining industry understands that you have to test samples the size of this room to be able to say you have a representative sample of the deposit. Whereas us environmental scientists come along and we collect 250 milliliters, we do 10 of them. And we think that's a representative sample. That's not the case when you're looking at the distribution of mercury. It's literally called and published as the nugget effect. So what we also learned, same things the Malakoff work, is that turbidity is the key to reducing mercury in the environment for this project. Okay, so both of those have been checked off. The reservoir sediment removal efforts, I want to be clear, one of the things that comes up is, why don't you just take it out of the reservoir? There, you've removed the mercury, you removed the sediment, you can put it in a big pile over there, and now you've done enough. You've done enough to remove mercury. Well, it's a multi-benefit project, and when they were having the aggregate companies do the mining, they were actually selling that aggregate and that sand and being able to pay for that operation. So we have to look at the byproducts that can be sold with this project and the value of them to try and figure out how to do this type of process at other sites. We have restored water storage space simply by the removal of that volume. We've removed the environmental toxin. I could think that's the most important thing in the world, but that's not going to fund project, right? It has to pay for itself. So there's sellable aggregate that does come out of it. Whether or not the market keeps up with that, it's a whole nother economics game. You do get gold out of this process. I happen to think that's a very special kind of gold that came out of an environmental cleanup effort. And California likes special products that come out of, a cleanup effort or a recycling effort. My Patagonia jacket that's really plastic bottles. So I, as a consumer, would be very interested in that. But do we also see an improved fisheries, right? So do you see the mercury in the fish concentration go down? That's a really, really big question. And I'm very glad that we have more science going on with this project. So this project just got $8 million through the same BCP and Prop 13. And we have Department of Water Resources and Nevada Irrigation District and USGS and ourselves included working to develop how to operationalize this in probably spring of 2018. So it's very, very close. One of the reasons it's such a big price tag at this time is that it does have a lot of science associated with it. We do want to answer some of these critical questions. Specifically, do we improve the public health issue? And that's complicated. Reminding you how many dams there are in California, that sedimentation in these reservoirs is a statewide issue, how quickly they fill up with sediment, and that those dams have a finite lifetime unless we come up with these management strategies. So to address mercury, to pull all of these three different things I presented to you together, we've called it the Headwater Mercury Source Reduction Strategy. It's a document we've written that explains our strategy to clean up sources with the landowners, DPR, Tahoe National Forest. You can stop mercury from coming out of mine sites. You can also do other things to reduce sediment loads like fuels reduction around hydraulic mine sites. You can clean out the reservoirs themselves. There's lots of reason to do that, including getting the mercury out. And of course, continuing to educate people and make those fish advisories available through what we call post-it date, where we do go around with volunteers and put fish advisories up at these watersheds. The last thing, we have a working group of advisors that have helped us develop this initiative over the last 10 years. And without them, we would not have gotten as far as we have. By no means. The Department of Conservation has been involved with us probably since 2009, from the very beginning, giving us Sioggins was here at that time, giving us a really good idea of, these are the abandoned mine land problems that our state has that helped us shape how we think about this problem. And all of these agencies and organizations So the take-home message here is to work collaboratively with agencies and build relationships with people that last throughout your entire career, if you're lucky. So thank you. That is all I have for you today.